Should look in the mirror. I have a booger.
Biani, we're live.
You want me to go?
Okay, I think we are ready.
Hello, welcome back, spiritual practitioners. This season, we're centering learning.
That's right. We're your hosts, Sequoia and Biani, and we're here to delve into the heart of our conversations, focusing on the lack of culturally rooted resources to support QT BIPOC folks navigating religious and spiritual trauma.
So, in our previous seasons, we emphasized the importance of unlearning, decolonizing, and divesting from oppressive teachings and institutions. If you're new here, welcome, and make sure to check out our previous episodes on our channel. But today and now, we're actually dedicated to deepening our knowledge and understanding so that we can better support ourselves and our clients.
As we navigate this season of learning, we aim to provide you with the tools, tips, and insights to help you on your path of reclaiming to soul work.
Whether you're well versed in spiritual practices or just beginning your journey, join us as we explore the intersectional impact of religious and spiritual trauma on mental health.
So sit back, relax, and get ready to elevate your understanding of mental health and spiritual well-being as we embark on this season of learning. Let's get started.
All right, y'all. Welcome to episode 28. We're exploring religious trauma and ATRs. And for those who don't know what ATR stands for, it's African Traditional Religions. And for a minute, Sequoia and I have been talking about religious trauma. I would say even in the beginning of our work, like with the podcast, we've always sort of centered some aspect of religious and spiritual trauma. And we wanted to kind of give you a little sense of why we're doing this topic today. We're doing this topic today because we feel like it's time for us to really have the conversations that are not being had when it comes to religious trauma. We have found that a lot of conversations about religious trauma are still really narrow and limited definitions that really focus on Christianity and Christian supremacy. And we haven't really heard conversations about the experiences of religious trauma in other spiritual and religious practices. And we also want to be able to do that in a conversation that centers QT BIPOC folks who might be navigating ATRs. That's why we're doing it. Did you want to add something, Sequoia?
Yeah, I think this conversation is also a part of decolonizing, deconstruction work. We've shared before during many IG live chats and then also on our podcast, that there are more folks that are leaving their religious homes. I would say that my eyes have been more on Black POC communities related to this conversation. And so with more folks kind of looking at deconstructing, decolonizing, and then disaffiliating from these particular religious homes, there is a need for therapists, folks to do any type of spiritual, mental health, well-being support to really look at religious trauma, religion, spiritual spaces, from a perspective of how can I educate myself so that I can be a support to my clients that might have this background. So that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this. And again, we are coming from an intersectional perspective. We've talked about our experience related to Christianity, and then these different kind of areas within that. But there are these wider kind of conversations, more intersectional, diverse conversations that should happen related to, Black and POC experiences in religious and spiritual spaces. And so this is us opening up the conversation in the community to have those conversations. So, yeah, I'm excited.
I'm really excited, and I think you did a great job at like kind of grounding us. I think one thing I want to say too is that we get there's been like some conversations even in other spaces where like folks are leaving the religion of their family of origin and they go into sort of other spiritual and religious practices hoping for something different from like what they experienced from their family of origin. And sometimes what people find is that some of those things that they were hoping to leave from like their family of origin, they might find in these new religions that they're participating in or like engaging in. And we've heard that like when it comes to ATRs for like Black queer and QT folks, Black queer and trans folks. And so we're gonna have the conversation, y'all. And again, like Sequoia said, it's intersectional, holds nuance, important complexities. So if you are here because you want to have the conversation too, please, let's dig in, share in the comments. If you have anything you'd like to share, if you have questions for us, like please hit us up. We'd love to be in conversation with you around this. All right.
Okay, welcome everybody. Reclaiming Soul Work is a heart-centered podcast that centers the experiences of two Black queer femme spiritual social workers and healers who explore the intersection of magic, spirituality, mental health, and everything in between. My name is Sequoia. I use she and her pronouns. I am currently in Charlotte, North Carolina on Catawba Indigenous land. My big three are an Aquarius sun, an Aries moon, and Libra rising. I have an emotional support puppy named Winnie. I wear many hats. I am excited to be here with you all today talking about this topic. I think I'll keep it at that.
Keeping it cute. So Biani, she, they pronouns, Black, Dominican, non-binary queer femme, mama, social worker, therapist, writer, tarot reader. And I am living in Lenapehoking, also known as Philadelphia. Been here for a minute, so might as well call it home, as people want to remind me. And I was going to say my big three, Virgo sun, Cancer rising. And I'm excited about Cancer season, so I definitely want to be like Cancer rising. An Aries moon. And yeah, happy to be here with y'all.
Nice. Thank you so much for wrapping us up with the introductions. We've shared a little bit about, like why we are talking about religious trauma overall this particular season. I didn't know, Biani, if there was anything more that you wanted to add. There was one more thing that I can say just about the importance of therapists in different spaces having conversations about religious and spiritual experiences in those spaces, the importance of that, and that this conversation is not just relegated to like spiritual therapists. I would think that anyone that is providing any type of social, human service, spiritual advisement, energy work kind of support at some point will ask a question about religious affiliation, within your family, what's your experience with that, and so being able to really have a comprehensive and supportive conversation, about folks' experiences in religious and spiritual spaces is really important. So yeah, like that's another, again, just wanted to circle back to like why we're having this conversation. Biani, was there anything more you wanted to add, or shall we just move on?
I think one thing that just came up for me too is like, we don't know how to have the conversation. And that's why we're really like dedicating a whole season to this, because we have found, whether you are a spiritual therapist, a therapist who's spiritually curious, you could be a Reiki practitioner, energy healer, yoga practitioner. It's still hard to have the conversation around religious and spiritual trauma. And yet it's the thing that keeps happening because we're not having the conversation. And so, that's why we're here. That's why we're here to talk about it. And we hope that you all can have an open heart and mind, stay curious, stay rooted in the questions, and know that, like, we're here to really learn and understand it so that we can really grow and support folks, to support ourselves and and the folks that we're holding space for. So that's what I'll say.
Okay, cool. Well,
All
I
right.
think we are, ready.
Yes. So we are ready to we're ready to welcome in our guest who's going to introduce themselves. And we are so excited. Our first guest of the season. And yeah, I mean, we're gonna go right in. So Oñi, come right on in, friend. Welcome.
Greetings, greetings.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself for those who are like just tuning in? You're welcome to
Okay,
introduce yourself, or you can use, what we did. If you want to share like your big three, or however you'd like to kind of.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. So my name is Iya Oñi Soi, also known as Melissa Eiffel. I am an Iya Losha, and I'm initiated into the Lukumi spiritual practice. I'm a priest of Oshun. And I'm a licensed clinical social worker, have been a licensed clinical social worker for 25, well, I've been a licensed clinical social worker for 16 years. I've been a social worker for 25 years. I am a wellness coach and a spiritual wellness coach who enjoys having interfaith conversations lately. That's a lot of what I've been doing. And really supporting people on their spiritual journeys and looking at themselves holistically as whole individuals, not broken people. We are not broken people. Um, and I do such a poor job of knowing the names of the indigenous tribes on the land that I come from and the land that I'm in, currently reside in. However, I like to say that I'm a daughter of the diaspora. So I was born in Guyana, which is the only English speaking country in South America. So I am Caribbean by culture, raised in New York City, Brooklyn, and Queens. Have lived quite a few places, currently living in Georgia. Oh, my big three. I'm a Pisces stellium child. I have Pisces in 4 houses. So I'm all water. I'm a Federal Notion. I'm all water. And my rising is Aries, actually. That is one of the few places fire shows up in my chart.
Oh my gosh. So we got this. So your rising's Aries. We're both Aries moon. Y'all better get ready. I'm like, ooh, we bringing the heat. We're bringing in the heat. Oh, well, we were both wondering where you were living, so it's nice to hear. We had this feeling. We weren't sure where you were at, so you're in Georgia. Ooh.
Yeah, I'm in Georgia. I've lived here for a few years, but I don't claim it. I still claim New York. People still think I live in New York. So
I thought you were still in New York. I was like, I think she's in New York.
everybody still thinks I'm in New York, which I take that with great pride. That means that I don't have a Georgia accent. I still have my New York accent. I still give my New York vibes. So yes, I'm a New Yorker through and through, no matter where I've lived.
That's facts. All right, so um, we are going to get right into it. And our first we want to sort of hear from you a little bit about what you feel the landscape of therapy is right now as it relates to like spirituality, ATRs. like culturally relevant spiritual practices? Like, what are you noticing?
So, that's a very interesting question. First of all, I want to say that it feels important for me to name that, ATRs, African traditional religions, that's a very broad uh, title name group, right? We know that one, there are hundreds of spiritual practices practiced throughout the diaspora, and that stem, from Africa, right? We also know that, these traditions are practiced differently based on the tribe that you're from, right? Based on the community that you're from. And we also know that because many of these traditions have become diasporic because of the transatlantic slave trade, they're practiced even more differently depending on the lineage that you're from and the country that the lineage that you're from is, rooted in. So I just want to give context to I'm speaking based off of my familiarity with the Lukumi tradition, which is also known as Santeria. Excuse me. I have other challenges around saying that I'm a practitioner of Santeria only because I don't synchronize the Orisha with the Catholic saints, right? But we do know that these traditions and many traditions became hybrids or different or shifted throughout the diaspora, and that there are many different traditions as well. So I just want to say that. However, how I like to frame it in my mind is typically we're talking about Abrahamic traditions, and then we're talking about non-Abrahamic traditions, right? So we're talking about, Muslim, Christianity, and maybe Judaism, which tends to be central. People are familiar with, people are comfortable talking about and asking those questions. However, when we're talking about non-Abrahamic traditions, people are also very comfortable talking about, Hinduism, right? They can also be very comfortable talking about people who are even atheists, who, have no spiritual tradition. But what I've experienced is the level of what I believe to be anti-Blackness that comes forth when we begin talking about African-centered spiritual practices, right? Spiritual practices that come through the diaspora, but that are rooted in straight up and down Africanness. And so it's interesting because over the course of the past, I would say 6 months, I've seen a lot of people lean more into their spirituality. And because as BIPOC people, especially, Black people living in America, and mostly throughout the Americas, even in the Caribbean, being Christian tends to be the most central faith-based identity that people are verbal and vocal about. In these therapy streets, it's real hard. You know what I mean? Like with a capital H, capital ARD, to have clinicians of color, I would even say predominantly Black clinicians, have conversations with and about individuals who are faith-based and not rooted in Christianity. And there's a lot of judgment, there's a lot of misinformation, and we do have to recognize that misinformation is rooted in the fact that, many of our practices are so sacred and they need to be so protected because there has been so much judgment, there has been so much punishment because of the ways that we practice and the misinformation surrounding it. And so, yeah, many people don't talk about it. And when you try to introduce it, when you even bring up something that would be relatively, I would consider mainstream as tarot or astrology, there's all of these conversations about if it's appropriate to discuss that in the therapy room, much less, talking about Ebo, right? Sacrifices, right? Much less talking about spiritual ceremony and the impact that it may have on you, much less talking about someone who engages with spirit regularly, meaning sees spirits, communicates with spirits. And so these are conversations not really had often. And when we attempt to broach them, when I've attempted to broach them in different therapeutic communities, I find that the most pushback I get are from Black clinicians. So that's how it is in these therapy streets.
It's hard out here with these. Are you saying like Black Christian therapists? Because we've had interesting experiences with some yeah.
Yeah, so I think Black Christian therapists. I also think, most of them do tend to identify as Christian, but I just think there are a lot of therapists, Black therapists in particular, I find that even if they don't necessarily practice their own faith tradition, we tend to be more letter of the law than any other group that I've engaged with. We tend to be more afraid of losing our license. We tend to be more afraid of, stepping over ethical boundaries. We tend to be very afraid of being bold enough to ask questions and to get curious because we don't want to tap into anything. So we tend to be very, very, very safe more than any other group. I've been in groups. I mean, I could really go on and on about this, but what I'll say is
Please
I see non-melanated people take rituals and, spiritual practices and study them and repackage them as evidence-based practices all the time. I was having a conversation with a colleague today, and she was asking about a certain modality that she had just heard about and that she was, thinking about learning. And I was like, that's sound healing. Like, somebody took sound healing, repackaged it, said they studied it, and then that's, EMDR. The roots of EMDR is intense meditation. It's, bilateral stimulation, which we do all the time in our spiritual practices to enter into meditation. It's the reason why we dance. It's the reason why we drum, because we understand how spirit shows up that way. So I find that non-melanated people are very, 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 very open. And they're so open that they'll go see it, feel it, experience it, know that there's something there, study it, repackage it, and sell it back to us, saying that it's okay for us to do. And, we're in a corner, like, let me pay you $5,000 to learn this thing that our people have been doing forever because we don't have evidence that it really works. And so I find that we are very, 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 very letter of the law, and we know why we're that way. I believe that we're that way. That's something that's embedded within our DNA for protection. However, it doesn't give us freedom. And I believe that the therapeutic that the reason why we're supposed to be engaged in supporting our people ultimately is freedom. And so if we're stuck in bondage ourselves, then we're not doing the work of freedom, right? We're not really doing the work of healing. We're doing the work of symptom amelioration. And if that's what we're doing, then we could just say that, we can just say that, but we're not doing the work of freedom, many of us.
We are not doing the work of freedom. We're doing the work of symptom amelioration. That's a whole bar right there. There's so much that you said that I want to come back to, but Sophia, do you want to?
So much. I love
this stuff forever, by the way.
I love this conversation. This is one of the reasons why, we wanted to have you on. Crystal in the comments is, affirming this piece about Black therapists being conservative, on this conversation. I think sharing about our experiences in other therapist-centered Facebook groups is so important. I was telling Biani, one of the IG lives that we got a lot of engagement on was our IG live where we talked about our experiences in Facebook groups with other therapists when spiritual topics come up, and the responses, the judgment that we other therapists get in the comments, when we're responding back. And that from our last IG, one of the kind of snippets that came out of that, was that therapists those judgments are the master's tools, and that's how therapists use the master's tools, is by being judgmental even to other therapists. So, I think it's important to have these conversations. Um,
And the reality is not even just judgmental towards other therapists, but if you're doing this to me in a professional space where supposedly there is equity, what kind of conversations are you having to and about and with the people who you serve, right? Because no matter how much we want to pretend that there's equity in the room, most therapists function from a top-down perspective, right? Where there's a hierarchy in the space and they view themselves as the expert. And so what we know about African-centered spiritual tradition is that many of us practice in secret. And so what I always like to tell therapists is you have a client. You have a client in your chair who has spiritual practices you have not even touched on because they don't feel safe to tell you. You have a client in your chair who is having spiritual experiences that they don't feel safe to discuss with you. And so, when trauma shows up in these spaces, because we're dealing with humans, so trauma is going to occur in every single space that we're in. That's the truth. So when trauma shows up in these spaces, they're telling you that they're having a conversation with a friend, or that their friend has done something to them, if they even tell you about the situation at all. But they're not telling you that it might be a spiritual teacher. They're not telling you that it might be a spiritual God sibling, right? And those dynamics are unique. Those dynamics are very, very, very different. And it can leave the individual that you say that you're serving feeling extra alone because they're having an experience that they either can't share or they can't share the fullness of.
Whew, I mean, and this is why we've been so consistent, about what is not being talked about, right? Like, I think we make these assumptions as therapists, and I would say Black therapists, we make a lot of assumptions that we're connecting with folks around like our shared racial identity, and then we're not talking about spirituality, we're not talking about gender, we're not talking about sexuality and queerness. Like, there's so much that gets left out when we don't make space for spirituality, to be honest. And I think there's a way that that we kind of just like we really can miss it. And also thinking about our training, that religious trauma, I think Sequoia and I have talked about it. I've never gotten a training on religious trauma or even talked about it in our programs. And if there was any conversation about religion, it was like Christianity or quote unquote, like the sort of mainstream traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But even the way that religious trauma is talked about doesn't really connect to Black folks. Like, the experience of religious trauma for us is different than a person talking about a cult in a Mormon church or quote unquote being controlled and abused. Like, the experience of religious trauma for us has way more complexity to it and nuance that doesn't even get held or considered.
Excuse me. For those of you who are listening, I'll just say that a cough showed up today, and so I'm present with it, right? So you may see me sipping on my tea or like muting myself a little bit. But I do want to address that because, as I was thinking about our conversation today and even thinking about my own experiences, I think I'm developing a challenge with this phrase religious trauma. I think for me, how I'm viewing these experiences is trauma that happens in the context of spirituality, trauma that happens in the context of religious identity or religious community, because the religion is not what gives you trauma, right? Embedded at the root of Christianity even is not a traumatic experience. It's how the human then took this information and these traditions and this understanding, interpreted it, teaches it, engages with it for the oppression of others. And so that can happen in any environment that you're in. because anytime we're dealing with human beings, right? And in particular, when we're dealing with sacred traditions that are done, that are not widely popularized in terms of how ceremony happens or the text that we use to learn, the trauma occurs, but the trauma is not, the root of the trauma is not the actual faith tradition. The root of the trauma is how the human has co-opted and taken and shifted that faith tradition. Does that make sense to you, what I'm saying?
So, yeah, I guess I want to hear more. Like, are you talking, can you give us an example of how that?
Yeah, I've begun having more interfaith conversations recently, and I actually hosted an interfaith conversation not this Sunday, but last Sunday, right? I have a spiritual goddaughter who she is of the Muslim faith, and she still practices her faith, and she's a part of, my spiritual tradition. Her father is an imam. I also had a wonderful woman who I've been in a relationship with for a few years, like working relationship with for a few years, and we've gotten to know each other very well. And she identifies as being Christian, and she grew up in a very Christian, Bible thumping household. Like, I always call her my prayer warrior, right? And we were sort of dissecting sacred safety. So what does it mean to be in sacred relationship and to feel safe? And so we were talking about Christianity, like the basic fundamental tenets of Christianity that are even espoused in the Bible, right? That were spoken by Jesus, which is essentially to love each other, right? There are many different takes on it. And then there are all these other rules that were placed on top of it. There are all these other restrictions that are placed on top of it. And so then you lose the fundamental law, which is simply to love each other. Within my faith tradition as well, I've seen some things happen when it comes to queer and trans, right? BIPOC folks in this community. And the reality is, every teacher, every leader, every person who has the opportunity to learn and to interpret Odu, which is our sacred text that we learn from, has the ability to learn it, to interpret it, and to engage with ceremony and to engage with the individuals that come to them for teaching and support in a way that can be helpful, or they can choose to take that information and filter it through a lens that can be harmful. The information that is there, the spirit that is there, the God that is present in it, is not intended to do you any harm, right? And so even as we're talking about ritual, even as we're talking about ceremony and certain things that may need to be done based off of the assignment at birth or the body parts that you were born with, how that is explained to you, how that is told to you, whether that's done with love or not, is what determines if there's harm, right? So it's not just the information, but it's the container in which that information is given. It's the energy with which it's displayed. It's if somebody is choosing to show up with love and sensitivity for you as you learn, as you cope, as you transition, as you begin new understanding, or are they simply meaning to impart upon you a perspective that they hold, or not give you any information because they simply want you to follow their rules for the sake of keeping you in a box for their ego. So we're dealing with humans who are tasked with interpreting spirit. And anytime we are dealing with humans that are tasked with interpreting spirit, we have to be aware of what is being filtered through the lens of human, which more often than not is ego.
I actually wonder if we can go back a little bit too.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this way too that you're talking around or talking about how humans are misusing or like abusing the traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what I'm hearing?
That's exactly what you're hearing.
Yeah.
We're dealing with a human issue. We're dealing with a
And
human issue,
so
not a spiritual issue.
so I guess so how do you, based on your work, right? Like your practice in ATRs or Lukumi, how does your practice address, like what has been your experience, or at least what have you witnessed around the way like Black, queer, and trans folks have
Mhm.
experienced the practices of Lukumi? Like what have you noticed in that?
So I think first, one of the things that anybody who's received a reading will know, because I want to be mindful. you know so much of what we do is sacred, right? Like I want to be
Yeah.
mindful that I'm not sharing things that are not permitted to be discussed widely. But when we're talking about receiving a reading, let's talk about that, which is most people's first entry point into the spiritual system, right? So they may see a Babalawo, they may see a Babalosha or Nialosha, and they go and they receive a spiritual reading because they want to get some information about their life. That diviner is going to ask you for your name, and that diviner is asking you for your birth name, right? So if you are a queer individual and you've changed your name, right? And if there's still trauma associated with deep emotion and maybe even grief associated with saying your birth name, and the diviner is asking you for your birth name, that can be a trauma point if you don't expect that, right? If in certain types of ceremonies that we do, depending on how people, depending on the ceremony that's being done and the I'll say genderized body parts that you're born with, right? So if you're someone who is born with a womb, someone who is not born with a womb, then you may have different things to do in that ceremony that may or may not fit your gender, right? Your gender identity. And so that can create harm or cause harm, bring up harm, depending on who's explaining that to you, depending on how you're being oriented, right? Because you'll be in a space and they'll just say all women turn around. And so what if you don't identify as being a woman, but you have a womb, right? Or they'll say men do this, women do this. And so how does that impact you, right? Or if you go to a diviner who is not trauma informed, who is not LGBTQ informed, and you physically present to what they would identify as a man, right? And you give the name Linda as your birth name. You may be dealing with someone who looks at you a certain way. You may be dealing with someone who is confused. You may be dealing with someone who, you know what I mean, who now has a lot of questions before they can proceed with the service that you're paying for. And you may be dealing with someone who has a lot of judgment. And then that judgment comes up in the information that is being provided. And so we have to be aware that what is done for a reason, it's often done for a purpose, and the language by which that is communicated, how that is communicated, how you're even oriented. When you go into ceremony, when you go into service, nobody's telling you what you're getting ready to do. And actually, many things you cannot know what you're getting ready to do until you're in the middle of doing it. So you have no idea what's going to be asked of you. You have no idea what is going to show up in the body as a trigger that this feels unsafe, this feels different, this doesn't feel what I thought I was getting ready to go into. So it can be very, very, very jarring, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it's making me think too of like, yeah, actually, Sequoia, do you have anything you want to add or ask?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a therapist, I have just a lot of questions around supporting someone as they reconcile potentially going into a ritual or a ceremony and they don't know what is going to happen, and there may be some gendered directions that are given. And so how, like, how do you support someone who is preparing themselves to experience something like that, who might identify differently than what the gender
directions that are given.
instruction,
Yeah.
might be calling for related to the ritual? So like I'm trying to get to like the application of what I'm hearing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the first thing is they have to feel comfortable with you to be able to discuss with you the fact that they're getting ready to go into ceremony, right? And it is best if you at least have some orientation to what they may or may not know. Not that it's your responsibility to direct them in that. That would be the responsibility of the person that is guiding them in the ceremony, that is introducing them to it. But if you understand, right, that they may not know what they're getting into, you can at least begin to ask questions and encourage them to ask questions. I think that piece is the dominant piece. I think a lot of times when we're seeking teachers, we can be in such a rush to find what we think that we've been looking for our whole life that we don't take the time to ask questions and to give information about who we are and the concerns that we have. I think it's important, especially when you have a history of trauma, no matter what that trauma looks like, that you're aware of what safety looks like and feels like to you, and that you're making sure that the environments that you're entering in feel safe to you. And if not the environment, because you don't really know what the environment is that you're going to be walking into, the person that is going with you into that environment, right? Like you don't just show up at someone's door and knock and say, oh, I need ceremony. Typically you have a relationship that you've built and developed, or at least this is my recommendation, that you have a relationship that you've built and developed with the person who you will be entering into ceremony with, that there's information that they understand about you, and that you understand how they feel about that information. I recommend that it's someone who you can share yourself emotionally with, right? Where you feel emotionally safe. Because we're dealing with spirit, right? Because we're dealing with spirit, you don't know what's going to show up in you, what's going to show up through you in any environment. And so understanding that level of safety is the foundation, and having conversations, open conversations with the person who is supporting you in this journey is critical. You should feel safe enough to say, this is the gender that I was born with, or these are my concerns, or is there anything that I need to be concerned about based on this history, or how will you support me during this journey, right? How can you support me during this journey? And you want to make sure that they're sensitive to those things, because that ultimately, that relationship is where your safety will, your sense of safety will lie.
Thank you. We have a question too from the audience. Yay. I think if this could be spoken to, they're wondering why quote unquote birth names or dead names are used over the name that a person would like their chosen name.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something you can speak to if possible?
So what I'll share, so I still consider myself to be a baby priest, so I don't know everything, and I'm certainly not a babalao, right? And I have not entered into the art of divination in that way. However, what I will share is this: most of our work is done with and begins with our ancestors. And in our spiritual tradition, we believe that our ancestors and our spirits came earthside with a certain sense of knowing. And so when we're looking to connect to spirits in the space of divination or ceremony in general, there's that tie, right, that we're looking to make from when you came from the spirit realm to earthside. And your your given name, your birth name is the first name that you were given. And so in my interpretation, and once again, this is simply my interpretation, it's the closest uh piece of identity to the energy of your spirit from the time that your spirit came earthside into human form. And so we always want to connect to the oldest energy. We always want to connect to, quote unquote, like the purest form. And so because that allows the communication to be clearer. And so, that's my interpretation for why that name is given. Now, could there be, diviners who will be able to use your chosen name, or, I don't know if the, term new name is appropriate, but probably, right? Probably, but that is not something that I've seen. And I also know that these traditions are ancient. We're talking 8,000 years old, 10,000 years old, a way of doing something. It's a spiritual science. And so has that science been proven in a new way? I don't know that, right? So that, I don't know that someone would feel comfortable giving you all that you need with, doing it a different way, right? Because this is the way that we're taught to do things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, it's sitting with me. I think there's something about it that feels hard to sit with, if I could be honest, around what it means for like queer and trans folks, in certain practices, right? Like there's something about that that feels like, wow, like this is something that people should know, like when they are
And I
considering. Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that that's why it's so important to have these conversations, and it's so important for people to feel safe with the people that they're receiving services from, to have these conversations. Safety is important for all of us, but when you have a unique history, when you have anything that's super important to you to share, I think that you have to be in a space that feels safe, right? I think we tend to think about these relationships as super transactional. I can just go find a Babalawo, any botanica, or I can go find somebody online who might be in Nigeria and give them my personal information, and they're going to give me a reading, and that's okay. These traditions are based off of relationships, right? Historically, you had a village, you had a village practitioner, many and likely many different practitioners within the village who knew you, who cared about you, who were sensitive to your needs, and who structured what they needed to do based off of you. Our relationship with spirit is so unique. It really is as unique as a fingerprint. And so we have to give ourselves the grace and the space to develop relationship and not function in these traditions as a colonizer would. I can dip in, I can dip out. I can pay for a service and have no relationship, take what I want from the reading, discard what I don't want. Maybe I only show up, to meet with the person when I have a crisis or a problem. These are systems of living, right? These are systems of living. You can certainly use it as a service, but you're really not going to get the most benefit from it, because these are meant to be systems of living, right? The Orisha are with us through everything. There's an Orisha that is a guardian, that's an energy that guards over everything. And so if you want to maximize your life, you want to be developing relationships with people who can support you in your life, and not also taking on a colonizer's perspective of, I'm just gonna dibble and dabble, without really having a relationship and knowing what you're in, right? Like knowing what you're getting into.
Well, yeah, I feel like we might need you to come back for a part two, because the conversation about colonization feels really important, especially like you said, around the way that humans start to, you know, enable practices that are actually colonized, like tools of colonization, right? Like when we're talking about gendered violence or gendered discrimination, And you said like anti-Blackness, like there are sort of things that feel really important that we might have to get into next time. And I know we're almost at the end of
Are we
our
really
episode.
already? That's a
Yeah.
lot. My bad.
No,
I feel like we didn't even get
you
into
are
meat
right.
and
No,
potatoes.
listen, we just need you to come back. That's what it is, Oñi. We need you to come back. Maybe we can think about like a closing question. Do you think we have time for a closing question, Sequoia, or should we just? I'm like, oh, so many. So
Yeah,
many
no, I
juicy.
think we need to
I think we're
do
at wrap up.
takeaways. Yeah, we need to do
Yeah.
takeaways, and
So we'll do some main takeaways, and then we want to make sure that you're able to share with folks how they can find you. And so, what are folks' main takeaways today? Anybody want to like share? I'm
I
sitting
can.
with my Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. My main takeaway is, I again, I would love to have a part two to this conversation. I think it's so important. I think another main takeaway, is that I'm really interested in get into some of the other questions that we have.
Do we
Um,
have to, do we have to, can we ask some of the other questions? Or no?
I unfortunately do have to.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Or we can
Mhm.
figure out another platform or another way to, you know, circle back to some of the other questions. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, what I'll share about this is my main takeaway is I think that I take for granted how much is known, right, about the traditions. And so when I start talking, I get deep. I get really deep. So it's important. It really is important for people to understand that these are people's lives, you know. And when we're talking about African-centered spiritual traditions, unlike other spiritual traditions, we're not just talking about the practices that you engage in. We're not just talking about the books that you read and what's said in the books. We're literally talking about how you've lived every single lifetime, right? And we're talking about how your ancestors show up to support you in every single lifetime. And so when we're talking about that, there's so much that we have to be able to support our clients with understanding as they enter into spaces and as they leave spaces. And so,
Yeah. Thank you. I'll say my main takeaway is that we need more time. I'm like, and I would love to have you come back. The other takeaway that I'm sitting with is like the one that I really honestly am sitting with is like feeling a sense of like curiosity about why there are certain practices that feel like they can harm queer and trans folks. And I'm just really sitting with that. And I don't just mean like ATRs, but just that's something that I've always been sitting with, but just thinking about that, especially Black queer and trans folks. So that's something that's just sitting with me that I'm like kind of making room for. So before we close out, I'm curious, like, I want to like encourage folks who are watching and tuning in right now to make sure you follow us on YouTube and on Instagram and stay connected. Make sure you comment, share, subscribe, and like, just let's keep this conversation going in the comment section. We'd love to hear from you. And if you want a part 2, let us know now or let us know when you can. We'd love to bring Oñi back. So let us know. And as we close out, is there anything you like? How can people find you? Do you want to share anything about your offerings or like the work that you do so people can stay connected to you?
absolutely. So I always tell people that the best place to find me is on Instagram. And it's at Melissa Eifel, LCSW. M is in Mary, E, L is in Larry, ISSA, Eifel. Just like I fill up a cup. IF is in Frank, ILL, LCSW on Instagram. And then my website is melissaaifel.com as well. Excuse me. I am hosting a retreat in August for, wellness practitioners who are spiritual in nature, no matter what faith tradition you are in. And while that retreat is focused on business, right, and helping people to connect and to orient their businesses and to center, giving people permission to center their faith in their work, we will also be having these types of conversations because it's so important for us to talk about the ways that we can support each other in the work that we're doing, and that we can show up to be full in supporting our clients in the lives that they're living in ways that can feel harmful. And can I just give like one closing thought in general? Because I do know that one of the questions was, what advice would you give someone before they go into or choose a spiritual home, right? Because, these traditions are done in the context of spiritual teachers, and, we call them ilays, or, spiritual houses. And the thing that I would encourage someone to do before they even think about entering the tradition, or even as they're thinking about entering the tradition, is first connect to your Ori, right? Which is connect to your inner understanding and your personal energy, because all the truth of what you need and who you are is already embedded in you. Second, connect to your ancestors, because your ancestors guide you. And then third, take your time in finding a spiritual community that's in alignment with you fully. We have to know our triggers. We have to know when, how, and where we feel safe. And we have to give ourselves permission to ask those tough questions so that we can find ourselves in places that are for the fullness of our development, and in spaces where we can be honest and where we can be authentic to who we are, so that we don't feel like we're engaged in additional trauma.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being here with us, Iya Oñi.
So, all
We
right.
are, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Biani.
Oh, I was just gonna close us out.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Y'all, thank you so much for being here in community with us and supporting a heart-centered podcast by two queer Black femme healers and spiritual social workers who explore the intersection of magic, spirituality, mental health, and everything in between. We'll be back in 2 weeks, y'all, for episode 29, and we're talking about we're having an intersectional conversation about religious trauma, so you don't want to miss that. And in the meantime, make sure you stay connected. We're really trying to build a spiritual practitioner and healing community. So make sure, if you haven't, subscribe to our YouTube page, our Reclaiming Soul Work podcast. Once you subscribe, you can set a reminder for notifications so you know when the next episode is coming. You can also sign up to our landing page on our website to be notified anytime we get a new episode or future offerings. And we also have our free monthly newsletter, First Quarter Moon. And make sure you follow us on socials too, on IG and TikTok. Thank you so much for being in community with us today, y'all. We really appreciate it. Thank you to our guest, Iya Oñi Soi. I'm so sorry I messed that up, but thank you, Iya Oñi, for being here with us. And we'd love to have you back. So if y'all want to see us for a part 2, let us know. And yes, take care, everybody. Bye.